The fog came up from the river at Fenwick Market the way it did every year in the last week of October, thick and grey, smelling of coal smoke, wet stone, and boiled cabbage from the kitchens along Candle Row. It sat over the charity school called Millbrook like a hand laid flat on a table. Patient, unhurried, waiting to see what the day would do. Constance Hale was awake before it lifted. She was the kind of woman a room forgot the moment she left it. Not ugly, not pretty. Simply unremarked, the sort of face that servants and gentry alike looked past on their way to someone worth looking at. 25 years old, she had buried a father in a poor grave 3 winters back, and had not cried where anyone could see it since. What she had instead of beauty or fortune was a needle, and hands that could take a torn seam and make it hold as if it had never torn at all. She mended for Millbrook 6 days a week, hemming and turning collars, and patching knees for 2 shillings and her dinner. She was good at it in the particular, unglamorous way that no one thanks a woman for. She could tell, by the weight of a sleeve alone, whether a girl had been growing or only wearing thin. She could tell by the way a hem hung, whether a child had been kneeling on a stone floor more than she ought. Something in that house was going to break before the week was out. It would not be a seam. Millbrook stood at the end of Candle Row, behind a brick wall gone black with soot. 40 girls inside it between the ages of 6 and 14, orphaned or given up or simply not wanted, fed on barley and taught their letters and their stitches, so that some family somewhere might one day want them as a maid. It was not a cruel place, as such places were counted. It was not a kind one either. It was run by a woman named Agatha Grieve, who wore her keys on a chain at her waist and her authority like a second spine, and who believed, with the flat conviction of a woman who has never once doubted herself, that a firm hand made a good servant, and a soft one made a ruined girl. Constance did not think much about Matron Grieve, one way or the other. She came at 7, sat in the mending room with its one high window and its smell of lye and old wool, and worked until the light went. She spoke to the girls when they came for fittings, plainly and without the softening most grown women used on children, and the girls, in turn, spoke to her more honestly than they spoke to anyone else in the house. She had never asked herself why. She would have said, if anyone had asked her, that she simply listened. On the Tuesday the fog did not lift at all. A small girl named Ivy came in for the letting down of a winter dress 2 inches too short at the hem. Ivy was 7, or near enough. She had come to Millbrook as a baby left at the gate with nothing but a scrap of blanket, and she had grown up thin and quick and watchful the way children do, when nobody in particular is watching them grow. She liked Constance the way a cat likes the warm side of a hearth, without ceremony, simply because it was warm. "Up on the stool, then," Constance said, and held out her hand. Ivy did not take it. She stood where she was a moment, working her jaw the way children do when they are deciding whether a thing is worth the trouble of saying. Then she climbed up, slow, one hand braced hard on the wall, and when her small body came to rest on the wooden stool she made a sound. Not a cry, smaller than that. A breath let out through the teeth. Constance looked up from her pins. "It hurts when I sit," Ivy said. Very quiet, not to the room. To Constance, and only to Constance, the way a secret is given to the one person a child has decided might not repeat it. There were 3 other women in the mending room that morning, 2 seamstresses and the laundry girl come to fetch linens, and not one of them turned her head. It was not that they had failed to hear. Constance understood that later, turning it over the way she turned over every stitch that did not lie right. They had heard. They had simply learned, long before Constance came to Millbrook, that some things were cheaper not to have heard. Constance did not learn that lesson. She never had. "Hurts where?" she said. Not a question, exactly, a demand, gentled only by her voice, which did not rise. Ivy's chin went down. Nowhere Ivy the girl looked at the door instead of at her. It was the look of a child measuring the distance between the truth and the trouble the truth would cause, and finding the sum came out wrong no matter how she added it. Constance set down her pins. She had learned mending from her mother, who had learned it from a mistress who beat her for crooked seams and taught her plain sewing anyway, because a trade, however got, could not be taken back once it was in the hands. Her mother had died the winter Constance turned 19, coughing into a rag she would not let her daughter see, insisting to the last that it was nothing. Only a chill, only a little blood, nothing to trouble anyone over. Constance had learned two things from watching that. She had learned to mend anything, and she had learned that when a person insisted a hurt was nothing, it was almost never nothing. "I am going to look," she said to Ivy, "and you are not going to be in trouble for it. Whatever it is. Do you hear me?" Ivy did not answer that. She turned, instead, and lifted the hem of her shift a few careful inches, the way a person lifts a cloth off a wound they already know is bad, bracing for the look on another face. Constance did not make a sound. Across the low ridge of the girl's thigh ran a set of marks laid one against the other in a pattern too regular to be a fall, going from red-purple at the newest to a sick yellow-green at the oldest, which meant this was not the first time. Constance had mended enough torn cloth to know what regular marks meant. Cloth did not tear itself in stripes. Neither, she thought, with a stillness that surprised her, did children bruise themselves in rows. "Who did this?" she said. Ivy's mouth closed like a door. "Ivy, you mustn't tell," the girl whispered. "She said if I told, it would be worse. She said no one would believe a workhouse brat over her, and it's true, isn't it? Nobody ever does." Constance looked, once, at the two seamstresses bent over their own work with a diligence that had come on very suddenly, and at the laundry girl who had found something urgent to do with a stack of sheets by the door. None of them looked up. None of them would say later that they had seen anything at all. What none of the three women in that mending room knew, and what Constance herself did not yet know, was that a fourth pair of eyes had been on the doorway the whole time. A man in a plain grey coat, unremarkable as a hired clerk, stood in the passage outside with a ledger under his arm, come that week to audit the school's accounts and conditions, on behalf of the charitable trust that funded it, a task he had insisted on doing himself, without announcement, under a name that was not his own. He had meant to note broken window latches and short-wayed flour. He had not meant to see a woman kneel on a cold floor in front of a frightened child, ask no one's leave, and promise, in a voice that did not know it was being watched, that whatever this cost her, the child would not be left to carry it alone. He wrote nothing in the ledger. He only watched, very still, the way a man watches something he has been waiting a long time to see and had stopped expecting to find. She did not know then that the plain grey coat belonged to Julian Ferris, Duke of Casterly, and that he had come to Millbrook that morning to test the school. She did not know that within the hour, without meaning to, she had become the thing he had come to test it for. Constance drew the girl's shift back down, gentle as folding a good linen for the last time. "No one is going to send you back to her today," she said. "Not while I am in this room." She did not know if that was a promise she had the power to keep. She made it anyway. Ivy did not cry. She had learned, the same as Constance had, not to cry where it showed. But her small cold hand found Constance's sleeve and held it, and did not let go, all the while the fitting went on, the two of them saying nothing further, the hem let down 2 inches in silence while, outside the door, a man in a grey coat stood a long moment more before he turned, quietly, and went to find the matron's books. Constance did not send Ivy back to the dormitory that hour. She kept her instead in the mending room under the excuse of a second fitting, wrapped a shawl around her that was meant for a paying customer's daughter and would be missed and accounted for later, and sat with her while the fog outside thickened into something that would not lift before dark. She did not touch the marks again. She had seen enough. When at last she walked Ivy back herself, rather than send her with the laundry girl as was usual, she passed the plain grey-coated man in the corridor, without knowing him for anything but a stranger the school had sent for. He stood aside to let them by. He did not speak. His eyes went once to the child's careful, listing walk, and something in his face closed like a hand around a coin he meant to keep. "Good day," Constance said, because it seemed rude not to. "Good day," he answered. Nothing more. She thought no more of him. She had a great deal else to think of. She did not know, walking away down that cold corridor with a bruised child's hand still warm in the ghost of her own, that the stranger behind her had just decided, watching her go, that he would learn everything there was to learn about the woman who knelt for children nobody else would kneel for, and that he would not rest easy in his own house again until he had. For 3 days after that, nothing happened, which was its own kind of proof, if Constance had known to read it as such. Matron Grieve went about the house with her keys at her waist, as she always did, sharp-voiced, unbothered, apparently unaware that anyone had seen anything at all. Ivy limped less by the 2nd day, and not at all by the 4th, and told Constance, when asked, only that it was better. In the flat, unquestioning way children accept whatever mercy comes, and do not think to ask its cause. Constance did not know that a physician had called at the school, on the Thursday, under the pretext of a routine inspection of the younger children's health, at no charge to the trust, and had spent a great deal longer with one small girl than the pretext required. She did not know that the fee had been quietly settled by a solicitor's letter that named no client. She only knew that Ivy walked easier, and was glad of it, and went back to her needle. The plain-coated stranger came twice more that week, always with his ledger, always brief. He asked Matron Grieve a great many ordinary questions about flour and coal and the school's accounts, and the matron answered them with the particular briskness of a woman certain she has nothing to hide from a hired clerk. He asked, once, almost in passing, whether the mistress of the mending room was reliable. Matron Grieve said Constance Hale was reliable enough, if plain-spoken past what was proper in a woman of her station, and thought no more of the question. Constance thought a great deal more, though she could not have said why, of a particular thing the stranger did on his 2nd visit. She was crossing the yard with an armful of linen when she saw him crouch, without ceremony, beside the boot boy who swept the school's step. A child of perhaps 10 with boots gone through at both soles, and ask him, quietly, how far he walked of a morning to reach the school. The boy answered. The stranger nodded, said nothing further, and walked on. It was nothing. It was the kind of small courtesy a decent man might pay any child. But it snagged in Constance's mind the way a loose thread snags on rough wood, and would not quite lie flat. 2 mornings later, The boot boy came to sweep the step in a new pair of boots, sturdy, well made, far past what a charity boy's wages could buy, and would say only, when the other children pressed him, that they had been left outside the kitchen door in the night, with no note and no name attached. Matron Grieve called it charity from the trust, and thought no more of it. Constance, folding linen in the next room, thought a great deal more, and said nothing at all because there was nothing yet to say. She was not the sort of woman who chased an explanation past what the facts allowed her. She only noted and set the note aside, the way she set aside a scrap of good cloth too small to use yet, but too fine to throw away. Somewhere, some day, it might be wanted. She did not know then that the boots, like the physician, like a dozen small mercies she would only piece together much later, one by one, like scraps sewn slowly into a single cloth, had all come from the same hand. She did not know that the hand belonged to a duke who had stood in a doorway and watched her kneel for a child who could do nothing for her in return, and had decided, in the space of that single act, that he had found the one thing in this world he had stopped believing he would find, a person who was good when she believed no one of consequence was watching. That knowledge was still some weeks off, for now there was only the mending room, the grey light through the high window, and a child who sat, these last mornings, without flinching. It did not last. On the Monday of the second week, the stranger in the grey coat came to the school for the last time under that name, closeted himself with Matron Grieve for the better part of an hour behind a closed door, and left without a word to anyone. Whatever passed between them, Matron Grieve came out of that room with her face gone the colour of tallow, and her voice, for once, not sharp at all. She sent for Constance that same afternoon. Constance came into the small office off the hall with her hands still smelling of lye, expecting to be told a hem had come loose somewhere, or that the trust's inspector had found fault with the mending accounts. She had not expected the matron to stand behind her own desk, with her keys silent at her waist, not touching them, and say, in a voice stripped of all its usual iron, that a formal inquiry had been opened into the conduct of this house, that certain marks had been noted and certain physicians' reports called for, and that Constance Hale, mender, was named in the inspector's report as the person who had first brought the matter to light. "I brought nothing to light," Constance said. "I only looked when a child told me to look. You will say that to the trustees," Matron Grieve said, "when they come." Her mouth worked once, as though she meant to say something further, some old certainty about firm hands and ruined girls, and found, for the first time in a long while, that she did not entirely believe it. You had no business interfering in the discipline of this house. She was 7 years old, Constance said, and it was not discipline. It was cruelty wearing a strap. She did not raise her voice to say it. She did not need to. She set the words down plain, the way she set a pin, and left them where they lay. She walked home that evening, through streets gone dark early with the season, past the baker's shuttered window, and the smell of tallow candles and wet coal smoke rising off the chimneys of Candle Row, and did not yet understand that she had, without meaning to, without seeking it, without asking to be seen at all, been seen. She thought only of Ivy, and of whether the child would be safe that night, and whether tomorrow the mending room would still want her in it. She did not know then that, in a house 3 miles beyond the market, in a study lined with ledgers that told the truth about a great many things besides flour and coal, a man sat late into the night, with his own hands folded before him, thinking of a woman who had knelt on a cold floor for a child who could not repay her, and had asked, in the whole of it, for nothing at all. He had built a fortune's worth of careful, distant charity on the theory that goodness, real goodness, showed itself only when it believed itself unwatched. He had begun, that week, to suspect he had finally found the proof of his own theory. He did not yet know what he meant to do about it. He knew only that he intended to see more of her, and that he would not be doing it in a grey coat, under a false name, for very much longer. The inquiry into Millbrook moved slowly, the way such things did when the house in question had a matron with friends among the town's better families, and Constance felt the slowness of it every day she came to work, and found the mending room the same lye smell, the same high window, Matron Greaves' keys still at her waist, though her voice had not fully regained its old iron. Ivy was moved, on the Trust's order, into a smaller room nearer the kitchen, where the undercook could hear her if she cried in the night. She did not cry in the night. She came instead each morning to the mending room before her lessons, sat on the same stool, and watched Constance work with the fierce, silent attention of a child deciding whom, in a world that had given her very little cause. She was prepared to trust. It was on one of these mornings that the man returned. He did not come in the grey coat, and he did not come with a ledger. He came dressed as what he was, plainly enough in daylight if a person troubled to look at the cut of the cloth, though Constance, bent over her needle, did not look up at once. It was Ivy who saw him first, and went still on her stool the particular way children go still around a stranger they cannot place. "You," Constance said, when at last she raised her eyes, and something in her voice held a note of plain surprise, nothing more. The inspector's man. "Not entirely," he said. He did not explain further. He asked, instead, whether he might sit, and when she gestured without ceremony to the second stool, he sat and watched her work in silence for a time that stretched longer than was quite comfortable, and that she did not think to fill with talk. Because filling silences with talk had never been a habit of hers. "You have not asked my name," he said at last. "You did not offer it," she said, and it did not seem to matter, to Ivy's leg, what it was. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of one, unpractised, as though the muscles required for it had gone stiff from disuse. "Julian Ferris," he said. "I sit on the board of the trust that endows this school." It was not the whole truth, it was not. She would learn much later, even the largest part of it. But it was true as far as it went, and she took it as such, the way she took most things people told her, at their word until their word proved otherwise. "Constance Hale," she said, and did not curtsy, because her hands were full of pins, and because it had not, in the moment, occurred to her that a man on a school's charitable board required one. He asked her, over the following half-hour, a series of questions that seemed at first no different from any trustee's dull inquiry into the running of the house, how long she had worked there, what she was paid, whether the mending room was warm enough in winter. But the questions bent, gradually, in a direction that was not about the house at all. He asked how she had learned her trade. She told him plainly about her mother, about the mistress who had beaten her mother for crooked seams and taught her plain sewing anyway. He asked whether she resented it, learning a trade at such a cost. "No," she said. "A trade is a trade, however you come to hold it. It does not care what it cost you to learn it. It only cares whether you can do it well." "That is a hard philosophy," he said. "It is an honest one," she said. "I have found the two are usually the same thing, and people who complain of the first are generally hiding from the second." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "I once knew a woman who wept beautifully at anything that touched her own comfort, and struck a servant across the face for spilling wine on her glove, and called it discipline, the same word your matron used to me not a fortnight past. He said it without heat, the flat way a man states an old wound long since gone numb at the edges. I have not entirely trusted tears since. Constance did not ask who the woman had been. It was not, she judged, a question a stranger owed her an answer to, whatever board he sat on. But she noted the wound the way she noted everything, and set it carefully aside, and said only, 'Then it is fortunate I have none to offer you.' That, at last, drew the near smile fully into being, brief as a struck match, gone before ivy, watching from her stool with the sharp unblinking attention of a child who misses nothing, could quite be sure she had seen it. He came again the following week, and the week after that, always with some plausible errand of the Trust's, always finding his way, before the visit was through, to the mending-room's high window and its lye smell, and the small girl who had taken to greeting him now with something less than fear. He brought her on the second visit a length of ribbon, offered without ceremony, and refused at first by Constance on the child's behalf as an extravagance the school could not account for, until he said, mildly, that ribbon was not accounted for in ledgers. Only love was, and love, unlike ribbon, cost the Trust nothing at all. Constance let the ribbon stay after that. He never touched her hand in those weeks. He never attempted to. But she noticed, without quite naming what she noticed, that his eyes went to her hands often, red-knuckled from lye and cold, steady always over her needle, and that something in his face when he watched them was not the look of a man cataloguing a mender's competence for a trustee's report. She did not let herself wonder what it was. Wondering, in her experience, cost a poor woman more than it ever paid her back. What she could not see, and what only he carried, was the weight of what he had learned in his own house that same fortnight, sitting late with the Trust's older records, discovering that Millbrook's accounts had been quietly bled for the better part of 3 years by a woman who signed her letters to the board with the particular flourish of someone who believed herself untouchable, a cousin of his own, well-placed, well-connected, the sort of high-born relation whose word carried further in certain drawing-rooms than A. Duke cared to spend his own credit contesting. He had known his cousin was cold. He had not known, until he began pulling threads, quite how far her coldness reached, nor that it reached, among other places, into a charity school where children went hungry, so that her allowance might run a little further. He said nothing of this to Constance yet. It was not, he judged, hers to carry before it was settled. But he began in those weeks to move certain quiet pieces into place, a solicitor's letter here, a discreet word to a magistrate there, the slow, unglamorous work of a powerful man doing right without asking to be thanked for it, and he found, doing it, that he thought of her steady hands more often than the work strictly required. He did not yet know how to tell her who he was. He had grown, over 10 years of dukedom, entirely too skilled at being watched for the wrong reasons, his rank, his fortune, his unmarried state, and entirely too unpractised at being watched, as he had been watched that first morning in the doorway, for the right one. He found, he wanted, badly and for the first time since his father's death had handed him the title like a debt, to be liked for something that was not his name. Millbrook had given him, without meaning to, the one place left in England where almost no one knew who he was. He was in no hurry to give that up. Lady Cordelia Vance arrived at Millbrook on a bright, hard morning in the second week of November, come down from the capital in a carriage with her family's crest on the door, ostensibly to inspect the charity school her cousin's trust endowed, and had, she had heard, been troubling itself over of late with some tiresome inquiry. She came into the mending room without knocking, trailing the cold air of the yard behind her, and found Constance Hale on her knees, pinning a hem for a girl of 9, and Julian Ferris, whom she knew perfectly well by his own name and no other, seated on a mending-room stool as though he had nowhere grander in the world to be. Julian, she said, and her surprise was not entirely feigned. I had heard you were playing at inspector in this dreadful little house. I did not credit it. Cordelia, he said, and rose, because manners did not desert him even when warmth did. You might have written ahead, I might have, she agreed, but then I should not have had the pleasure of finding you here. Her eyes went, deliberately, unhurried, to Constance still kneeling with a mouthful of pins, and something in her face arranged itself into the particular pleasant cruelty of a woman who has never once had to fear consequences for her own tongue. And who is this? Constance Hale, Julian said, before Constance could rise or answer for herself. The school's mender, among the finest I have had occasion to observe. How charming, Lady Cordelia said, in a voice that made the word sound like the opposite of what it claimed. One does not often see a duke take such an interest in a seamstress's competence. She let her gaze travel, unhurried, over Constance's plain dress, her chapped hands still bristling with pins. The darn at her own elbow she had not thought worth the time to mend for herself, though I suppose there is little enough else in a room like this to hold a gentleman's attention. Constance rose, at last, and set her pins down with great care, the way a person sets down something they might otherwise be tempted to use for a purpose it was not made for. If your ladyship has an opinion of my work, she said, I should be glad to hear it. If your ladyship has an opinion of my face, I have had it a good deal longer than your ladyship has, and I have made my peace with it. A small, sharp silence followed, into which Lady Cordelia's laugh dropped like 3 practised bells, bright and utterly without warmth. Plain speech from plain people, she said. How refreshing. I imagine it saves a great deal of time. She turned to Julian, dismissing Constance from the conversation with the ease of a woman shutting a door she had never expected to find locked. You will want to know, cousin, that the board is most displeased by this business you have stirred up. Matron Grieve has served this house faithfully a dozen years. One does not unseat a dozen years of faithful service on the word of a workhouse child and her seamstress. One unseats it, Julian said, and his voice, for the first time in Constance's hearing, went very quiet and very cold, on the word of a physician's report, a magistrate's inquiry, and the marks themselves, which I have seen with my own eyes and will not be argued out of by anyone's opinion of who is fit to have noticed them first. Lady Cordelia's smile did not move, but something behind it did, some small recalculation, quickly hidden. How very passionately you defend the mending room these days, she said. I begin to wonder whether it is the school's welfare that concerns you, or something rather nearer at hand. She left soon after, in a swirl of good wool and cold perfume, promising the board would hear a full account of the morning's insolence, and Constance stood a long while after the carriage wheels had gone, looking at nothing, her hands very steady, because she had trained them, over 25 years of being looked at and dismissed by women exactly like Lady Cordelia Vance, not to shake where it could be seen. "I am sorry," Julian said, low, once they were alone. "She has never in her life had to answer for the things she says." "I did not need your apology," Constance said. "I have heard worse, and from people with less excuse for it." She began gathering her pins, her voice level, plain, entirely without self-pity, which was, though he did not say so, exactly the thing that undid him more than any tear could have. Fair is not the same as kind. There is a difference, and I learnt it a good deal younger than she did. He watched her a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "I am beginning to think you did." The board's inquiry, once begun, could not be so easily talked back into silence, whatever Lady Cordelia's opinion of it, and by the 3rd week of November the whole slow machinery of charitable governance had ground its way to a single unhappy conclusion. Matron Grieve was to be removed from her post pending a full account of the school's discipline and its funds, and Constance Hale, as the person whose testimony had first opened the matter, would be called before the board to give it formally. She did not want to give it. She said as much to no one but herself, lying awake in her narrow room above the chandler's shop on Candle Row, listening to the cartwheels going over wet cobbles below. It was not that she doubted what she had seen. It was that she understood, with the plain, unsentimental clarity she brought to everything, exactly what it would cost her to say it aloud before a room of gentlemen who owed her nothing, and a matron who had run that house a dozen years and would not forget who had ended her running of it. Matron Grieve did not wait for the board to decide her fate before she moved to shape it herself. 2 days before the inquiry was to sit, the school's silver went missing from the strong room, a small but valuable service kept for the trustees' visits, and it was Matron Grieve, white-lipped and righteous, who informed the board's clerk that the mending room's key had been found. That very week, unaccountably not returned to its hook, and that Constance Hale. As the one person with regular unsupervised access to that wing of the house, was the only person who could account for it. It was a lie built of true small facts arranged to point the wrong way, the sort of lie that does not require much courage to tell, only desperation, and a working knowledge of how suspicion moves through a house that has already decided to be suspicious of the poor. Constance had, in fact, left the key on its hook the evening before, as she left it every evening. No one had thought, until that moment, to notice that the hook itself sat in a passage Matron Grieve alone still held the second key to. She was not arrested. There was no magistrate's warrant, no cell, nothing so dramatic as that. There did not need to be. It was enough that the board, hearing the accusation on the eve of an inquiry already grown uncomfortable for half its members, chose the simplest course available to men who wished the whole unpleasant business to be over. Constance Hale was dismissed from her post, without character, without the wages owed her for the fortnight past, and asked, with the particular bloodless courtesy such men reserve for the poor they are wronging, to remove herself from the premises before the hour was out. She did not argue it. She had learned, long before Millbrook, that arguing with men who have already decided a thing costs more than it ever buys back. She gathered her work-basket, her thimble that had been her mother's, the small folding scissors worn smooth at the finger-holes, and walked out through the yard where Ivy stood at the kitchen window, with both hands flat against the glass, not crying, because she too had learned not to cry where it showed, only watching, and Constance lifted one hand to her, once, and did not trust her own voice to call anything across the distance. She did not see Julian that day. He had gone to town on the trust's business and did not learn of her dismissal until that evening, by which time she had already collected her few things from the mending room and gone. She thought, walking home in the last grey light with her work-basket heavy on her arm, of writing to him. She had his direction, given carelessly one afternoon, in case some question of the child's welfare should arise. She sat that night with a pen and a single sheet of paper bought dear from the chandler downstairs, and wrote 3 lines, and tore them up, and wrote 3 more, and tore those up as well. In the end she wrote only this, that she did not wish to trouble a busy man with a mender's small misfortunes, that she was grateful for his kindness toward the child, and that she hoped he would not think of her further. She signed it plainly, without flourish, and sent it before she could reconsider, because she had decided, somewhere in the tearing of the first 4 drafts, that whatever had been growing between them in that cold mending room had been growing on false ground from the start. He was a trustee. She was a dismissed servant accused of theft. There was no honest shape their acquaintance could take now, and she would rather end it clean, by her own hand, than watch it curdle slowly into something that shamed them both. She did not weep, writing it. She told herself that was strength. She did not examine too closely why her hands, steady through every other trial of that long autumn, shook only a little, folding that single letter shut. She found lodging for a week with a cousin of her mother's on the far side of the market, a laundress with 6 children and no room to spare, and a kindness that made room anyway, and she took in what mending she could find from house to house, a shilling here, 8p there, and did not go near Candle Row, and did not ask after the school, and told herself each night that she had done the only sensible thing available to a woman with no name and no fortune to spend fighting a lie. It was the housekeeper at Casterley, a broad, dry-spoken woman named Mrs. Bell, who had run that great cold house for 11 years, and buried 2 husbands, and outlasted every steward who had ever tried to tell her business, who finally set the whole matter right, though it was not her habit to interfere in her master's affairs beyond what plain sense required. She came to Constance's lodging on a Thursday, unannounced, having got the direction from the laundress cousin, who was known to her through the washing trade, and let herself in with the brisk assurance of a woman who did not wait to be asked twice. "You're the mender," she said, by way of greeting. "The one His Grace has been like a bear with a sore paw over since you sent him that letter." Constance, who had been turning a collar by the last light through her one window, went very still. "I do not know what you mean by His Grace," she said carefully. "No," said Mrs. Bell, not unkindly. "I don't suppose you do, and that is rather the trouble, isn't it?" She sat, uninvited, on the room's single spare chair, and folded her hands, and looked at Constance with the particular assessing patience of a woman deciding how much truth a person could bear at once. "Julian Ferris, Duke of Casterley, is who came to your mending room in a grey coat, calling himself an inspector's clerk. I have kept his house since before he had a title to put in front of his name. And I will tell you now what he is too proud, or too afraid to tell you himself, which is that the boots on that boot boy's feet came from him, and the physician who mended small Ivy's leg came from him, and half the silent good that has been done in this town these 5 years, the rent quietly paid, the debts quietly settled, the doctors sent with no bill left behind them, has come from him, every time on the condition that his name never be attached to it." She paused. "He does not do it to be thanked. He has told me himself, more than once, that a kindness stops being a kindness the moment you hang your name on it like a sign over a shop. Constance sat with the collar forgotten in her lap. Why, she said at last, would a duke trouble himself to be a clerk? Because, Mrs. Bell said, he has spent 10 years watching people be whatever they think a duke wants them to be, the moment they know who he is, and he wanted, just once, to see who a person was, when they didn't know that at all. She leaned forward. He saw you kneel for a child who could do nothing for you, girl, and ask for nothing after, and refuse thanks when it was offered. And he has not, so far as I can tell, drawn an easy breath since. And now some spiteful woman with a key of her own has had you turned out of that school on a lie, and he has moved heaven and half the county to see it undone, and you sent him a letter telling him not to trouble himself further. She sat back. I have known that man since he was a boy too solemn to laugh at his own birthday. I have never once seen him trouble himself over anyone the way he has troubled himself over you. Constance did not answer at once. When she did, her voice was not quite steady, for the first time in longer than she could remember. He let me believe he was nobody, she said. He let you see him as nobody, Mrs. Bell said, gently now. There's a difference, and I think you know it better than most. Ask him yourself, if you doubt me. He is at Candlelight tonight, alone, and has been alone every night this fortnight since your letter came, and if you have any mercy left in that needle-worn heart of yours, you will not leave him alone in it much longer. The room at Casterly into which Mrs. Bell showed Constance that same night was smaller than she had expected of a duke's house, a private study rather than any grand receiving room, warmed by a low fire and lit by a single branch of candles, the walls lined with the kind of plain, well-used ledgers a man keeps not for show, but for truth. It smelled of beeswax and old paper, and, faintly, of wood smoke, nothing grand about it at all, and Julian Ferris rose from behind his desk when she was announced with an expression she had not yet seen on him, something unguarded, almost afraid. You came, he said. Mrs. Bell told me who you are, Constance said. She stood just inside the door, her hands folded very tight before her, steady, because she had trained them to be steady even now. I should like to hear the rest from you. He did not sit again. He came around the desk instead, and stood before her, close enough that she could see the fire had not entirely chased the cold from the long ride he had evidently just returned from, and he began, without preamble, the way a man begins a confession he has rehearsed too many times alone to soften now. I came to Millbrook in a grey coat because I had received 3 separate complaints of ill usage in that house over as many years, each one dismissed by the previous trustees as the exaggeration of a discontented servant. And I did not believe I would learn the truth of it if the staff knew a duke stood in the room. He said it plainly, without flourish, his eyes on hers, and not moving from them. I did not expect, coming there, to find anything beyond bad accounts and a hard matron. I did not expect to find you. You watched me, Constance said, that first morning, with Ivy. I did. He did not look away from that either. I stood in the doorway, and I watched you kneel on a stone floor for a child who could offer you nothing for it, not thanks, not payment, nothing at all. And I watched you promise her, in a voice that did not know it was being heard by anyone who mattered, that she would not carry it alone. I have built the whole of my life since my father's death on one private, unfashionable belief, that a person's worth is only ever proven in the moment they believe no one of consequence is watching them. I have tested a great many people against that belief, quietly, from a distance, and been disappointed more often than I care to say." His voice roughened, very slightly, the first true crack she had heard in it. "I wanted to see who you were when you did not know I was watching. That is the only test that ever tells the truth. You did not know how to be anything but yourself. That is why I am standing here now, unable to think of another single thing in this house that matters more than telling you so." Constance was quiet a long moment. The fire popped once and settled. "You let me be dismissed," she said, "and say nothing, and go to a laundress's spare room, while you knew who you were and I did not." "I did not let it happen," he said. "I did not know of it until it was already done, and I have spent every day since undoing it, the theft charge withdrawn in writing this morning, Matron Grieve removed from that house for good, and her conduct laid before a magistrate, your character restored to the board's own record in terms I dictated myself." He paused. "But you are right that I let the larger deception stand a good deal longer than I ought, because I was afraid, and I will not dress that fear up as anything nobler than it was. I was afraid that the moment you knew what I was, you would stop being the woman who told me plainly that fair is not the same as kind, and start being the woman careful gentry are with a duke. I did not want that woman. I wanted you. That was not your choice to make for me," Constance said. Her voice did not rise, but it did not soften either. "You had my truth from the first morning, freely given, because I did not know I owed anyone a performance. I did not have yours until Mrs. Bell gave it to me in a laundress's spare room, because you did not trust me enough to give it to me yourself." He did not argue that. She watched something in him absorb it and hold still under the weight of it, the way a man holds still under a blow he has decided he deserves. "You are right," he said quietly. "I have no defence to offer beyond the truth I have already given you, and my word that I will not conceal anything from you again, if you will allow me the chance to prove it slowly, the way you would trust any plain thing. By what I do, and not by what I say tonight, in a warm room with the fire, making everything sound better than it is." He drew a breath. "I am not going to ask you to answer me now. I have watched enough of my own family value the answer that comes quickly over the one that comes true, and I will not make that same mistake with you. Go home tonight. Take whatever time you need, a week, a season, longer if it wants longer. I would rather have your no, freely given, than your yes, because you felt a duke had cornered you into it in his own study, by his own fire. Whatever you decide, the board's letter stands. Your name is clean, Ivy is safe, and will remain in this town under my ward's protection, and no part of that is a bargain for anything from you. It was never a bargain. It was only ever the truth, arrived at late." Constance looked at him a long while in the low firelight, this grave, plain-spoken man who had watched her from a doorway and built a fortune's worth of unglamorous, secret goodness, rather than ever once ask to be thanked for it. And something in her chest that had been held very tight since her father's poor grave 3 winters back loosened, slowly, the way a seam gives when the thread finally wears through. "I do not need a season," she said. He went very still. "I have spent 25 years watching what people do when they think no one worth impressing is looking," she said. "I have never once, in all that time, seen it done as well as you did it. From a doorway, for a child who could not pay you back and did not know your name. I do not need a season to know what that is worth." She drew a breath that was for the first time that whole long autumn not entirely steady. "But I will have the truth from you, every day of it, from this night forward, not the comfortable part, all of it. I have been lied to gently by people who thought they were protecting me my whole life, and I would rather have your hardest truth than anyone else's kindest silence." "You will have it," he said. "I swear it to you as plainly as I know how to swear anything." "Then," Constance said, and something almost like the ghost of a smile moved at the corner of her own mouth. Unpractised as his own had been that first week, you may take that as your answer. He crossed the last small distance between them then, and did not take her in his arms as a man in a novel might have done. He took her hand instead, the right one, roughened and red-knuckled from a life of lie and needles, and drew the glove from it himself, finger by finger, slow, as though unwrapping something he intended to keep whole a long while, and pressed his mouth once to her bare knuckles, and did not let go of her hand after. "Constance," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name aloud, no station, no surname, nothing between them but the word itself. "I love you for the truth you gave a room that did not deserve it, and for nothing else. Not for what I can give you, not for the rescue, if that is what tonight looks like from outside it. I would have loved you exactly the same if I had never had a title to offer, and I need you to understand that before you agree to carry mine." "I do understand it," Constance said. "It is the only reason I am still standing here." "Then will you," he said, and stopped, and began again plainer. The way she had taught him plain was better. "Will you marry me? Not tonight, not because of anything that has happened tonight. Whenever you are ready to say it and mean it all the way through." "Yes," Constance said. It was the only word she needed, and she found she did not need to think very long to find it. He laughed then, low and startled, the sound of a man surprised into it, and for a moment the grave Duke and the grey-coated clerk and the boy Mrs. Bell remembered too solemn to laugh at his own birthday, were all, briefly, the same unguarded person, and Constance found, watching it, that she had never once minded a silence so little as she minded the one that followed, both of them simply standing by the fire with her bare hand laced through his, saying nothing further, because for the first time in either of their lives. Nothing further needed saying. They were married the following spring, quietly, in the small stone church at Candlelight, with none of the show a duke's wedding might have commanded had the duke in question wanted it, only the people who had earned a place in that particular room. Mrs. Bell in her best grey silk, dabbing at her eyes and denying she was doing any such thing. The laundress cousin who had given Constance a spare room when she had nowhere else to go, and Ivy, 8 years old now, and grown a full inch, seated in the front pew in a new dress that Constance had cut and sewn herself, because some things a woman does not hand off even on her own wedding day. Lady Cordelia Vance was not present. She had been quietly but unmistakably given to understand, in the weeks following the board's inquiry, that her further presence at Candlelight, or at any house where her cousin's wife might be obliged to receive her, would not be welcome, and she had removed herself to Bath before the spring was out, where she was said to entertain a small, dwindling circle who had not yet heard the whole story and could still be persuaded to laugh at her 3 practised bells of a laugh. Matron Grieve did not return to charitable work of any kind. Her name, once struck from Millbrook's records, was not restored to any other. A year later, almost to the week of that first fog-bound morning in the mending room, Julian Ferris sat by the fire in the same small study where he had once confessed himself, his boots off, a ledger closed and set aside for the evening, and watched his wife sew by the last of the light through the window. A habit she had never given up, and never would. because a trade did not care what a title had since been added in front of a person's name. Ivy sat on the hearthrug between them with a book open on her knees, reading aloud, slow and careful, sounding out a hard word twice before she had it. And when she had finished the page, she climbed up onto the low stool beside the fire and settled herself down against it, without a flicker of pain crossing her face at all. The way she had not flinched, now in the better part of a year. Constance's needle stilled a moment, watching her. She sits down easy now, she said, half to herself. She does, Julian said, and reached across the small space between their chairs, and found his wife's bare hand waiting for his, the glove long since put away for good, and did not let go of it for the rest of that quiet evening, the fire settling low, a single rook calling once outside in the dark and falling silent, the whole house wrapped around the three of them like a thing finally, entirely mended. It was, in the end, exactly as she had always believed it would be. What a person did when she thought no one of consequence was watching had never been the small measure of her. It had been the only true one,